reached here in Northern Ireland in 1998, which was historically and currently called the Northern Ireland Peace Process and the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement, as it is commonly known as. I think it's important to also state that we have had a number of other agreements since the Belfast Agreement in 1998. We had a political agreement in 2006 called the St Andrews Agreement, and it was the 5 main political parties in Northern Ireland agreeing with the British and Irish governments additional arrangements, additional political agreements that were to copper fasten the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. We then subsequently had another agreement in 2010, which is called the Hillsborough Agreement, and it again was the 5 main political parties in Northern Ireland along with the British government, and that was around what we call devolving policing and justice powers. So prior to 2010, the powers for policing and for the justice department was reserved in Westminster in London, and after a negotiation in 2010 it was agreed that those powers would shift from Westminster into Northern Ireland, and that created then our Department of Justice, which Minister David Ford now holds. So it's important just to set in context that it's not just the 1998 Good Friday Agreement that provided and provides the backdrop, the political backdrop, that there are 2 other important agreements and documents that also make up the political agreements that we have reached so far. I think it's fair to say currently there is a lot of what I would call political tension at the moment. There has been a lot of criticism levelled at the Stormont Executive, which is the seat of power in Northern Ireland. Many folk believe that the Stormont Assembly, Parliament, has not been delivering for the people on the ground, that the political squabbling and the infighting amongst the main parties has resulted in the public and political administration gridlocking, and that's probably not something that you should probably well accustomed to political gridlock as well in your own situation. So we have on the runs. So the on the runs, basically it was a number of Republicans, and in particular IRA people, had during the conflict had avoided being brought before the courts, or had avoided being arrested for being allegedly involved in political activities, some of which included mass murder and bombings. And so, unbeknown to the vast majority of the public, the revelation has came out that Sinn Féin, along with the British government, had agreed to have what we call immunity letters written and issued to, I think the latest figure is 228. So we've had 228 IRA activists have been issued with letters which has given them an assurance that they would not be sought for their past alleged crimes and activities as part of a political deal. So Sinn Féin was making the argument that for them, for their supporters, that the on the runs, in which there's at least 228, in order for them to strengthen and to secure support for the peace process, they had said to the British government that if letters of assurance could be given to these activists, that would copper fasten the peace process from a Republican perspective. And so the government agreed in secret, in private, with Sinn Féin to issue letters to 228 IRA personnel. And that has just came out into the public domain in the last 10 days, and it came out because one of the people who had received the on-the-run letter had been arrested whilst he was in London and had been on a wanted list. He was one of the most wanted people in Britain, and somebody somewhere hadn't realised that he had been given a letter of assurance that he wouldn't be sought or pursued by the authorities. And so subsequently he was brought before the court. He had allegedly been involved in a bombing which took place in London. It's called quite famously the Hyde Park bombing, in which 4 people died and 7 horses have been blown up and killed as well. And the guy involved, his fingerprints and lots of forensic evidence pointed to his involvement in this case. So he went to court, and his barrister, his lawyer, had produced the letter that his client had received from the British government as part of a political deal with Sinn Féin to say that John Downey had been given an assurance that he would not be prosecuted. There had been a media ban on the court proceedings up until the case collapsed, and then all restrictions were lifted, and that's when the public then became aware of these letters. So it has caused widespread condemnation and public outrage right across not only Northern Ireland but also right across the United Kingdom, because the case in point related to a bombing atrocity in London. So the victims have came out very, very strongly against the decision to grant what is in effect a de facto amnesty or immunity, and this has put a large strain and pressure on the political process.
And is this public? Like, do folks know who came in these letters? Does the public know?
No, they don't. Both Sinn Féin and the British government have refused to make the list of people who got the letters known. So it's quite a defining moment for our peace process and our political process at this time. And this thing that we're currently experiencing will probably run on for quite a bit, because every day there's something new coming out. And with so many atrocities that are still unresolved and no one has ever been convicted for, lots of people now, given that there's 3,600 people lost their lives as part of the conflict in Northern Ireland, many people are wondering if someone who is alleged to be involved in the murder of their loved one, they're wondering if they have received this letter. So I can't overestimate the importance of this particular development.
It's an interesting aside to the bombing in London. I was at Hyde Park the day before that bombing.
Really?
And the Queen's Horse Guard came the next day, and the finishing touches were being put on the viewing stand. The Queen was going out there. I assume it was to get the Queen. And when we landed in Boston, the news was plastered all over the television. Carnage of the horses and whatever. Of course, they missed the Queen.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it's quite a difficult time at this particular juncture. So, any other questions around that at this stage?
I noticed that you had two names for what everyone here would know as the Good Friday Agreement.
Yes.
Which would you use?
The Good Friday Agreement. I was present and part of the discussions and the negotiations during the Good Friday Agreement. I'm a member of the Progressive Unionist Party, which I should have...
PUP?
Yes,
yeah.
I should have maybe said at the beginning. So, yes, I would have been alongside David Irvine and Billy Hutchison during the discussions. I suppose at that time, in 1998, for loyalists, if you like, and the Progressive Unionist Party are obviously a working class unionist stroke loyalist party, and part of their job was to bring loyalism in terms of the armed aspect of loyalism, both in terms of the UVF and the UDA and the Red Hand Commando. Part of their job at that time was to give political advice to those armed groups and to ensure that those groups bought into and supported the Good Friday Agreement, much in the same way as Sinn Féin would have been ensuring that the IRA remained supportive of the political direction in which the country was heading. So I would have been heavily involved myself at a young age in terms of the street violence, and quite quickly became very politically involved, and unquestionably used physical force to defend and to protect my community and also my political beliefs. So I flunked school quite early and came out and gave up on school and basically got involved in conflict and became part of the engine room, if you like, and found myself then sitting at a negotiating table with sworn enemies, people who in previous times we literally would have torn each other from limb to limb. That we were then sitting around a table not unlike this one, trying to resolve differences which had bedeviled this country, depending on how far you want to go back, but as far back as 800 years.
Oh, I was going to say, 800 years. 800 years, we had a discussion about that at lunch.
I think you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemy. And in order to end conflict, that's exactly what we had to do. We had to make peace with our enemy. And I suppose, whilst it may be difficult for many people to accept Martin McGuinness or Gerry Adams or any other senior Republican who may have been involved in armed conflict, now sitting as a Democrat in a parliament, is difficult. But likewise, I know many Republicans who equally find it difficult to see Martin McGuinness sitting in government as well, because they see that as being a sellout, because Stormont is part of a British administration. They believe that McGuinness and Adams gave up the struggle, gave up the fight for Irish freedom and for a unification of Ireland, which clearly does not exist. So I think on both sides there are bitter pills that have to be swallowed and that is but one.
How about to these kids who are in high school and see conflict every day? Would you have any advice for them on how to move away from hating your enemy and something else?
Yeah, I think we all have our own beliefs. We all have our own perspectives and our own experiences. And you know, quite often you will come across people who disagree. In fact, very aggressively oppose your point of view. And in my own experience, I have had to suspend my judgment and my perception of people in order to see beyond the immediate conflict between me and that person or me and that situation. And it is about trying to look at the future in which you want to build for you as an individual and for you and your family and your wider community. And that has been the lesson for me. I have to work with people on a day and daily basis who I absolutely do not like. And I think that's true for all of us around the table. We have to work with people that we do not like. But that's natural. And life would be grey and boring if we all agreed and if we all shared the same views and same likes and same hobbies and same beliefs. And so it's about how you manage those differences and how you manage those relationships is what's important. And I suppose having been at the most aggressive end of conflict, it has allowed me, that personal experience has allowed me to see the consequences and the impact and the effect the conflict has, not just on you as the individual, but what that does then to your wider family and to the other person. And there are better ways of resolving conflict. And one of those ways we're doing right now is called talking. Be open to new ideas, be open to new beliefs and different understandings. And we all have our own perspective. And it's not to say that I or you are right. You know, in many cases, both of us can be wrong. And I think, certainly in our context, there has been awful things done on both sides. And no one has the monopoly on the hurt or the pain or the trauma or the loss that both sides have both inflicted and also received. So I think we have done awful things to one another, but we have a chance now, we have a better way of moving things forward. And I get up in the mornings and I think of my own life experience, I think of my own childhood, I think about the devastation that I experienced. And whilst the peace is imperfect at the moment, it is a hell of a lot better than what we had going on here 20 years ago. So, yeah.
I have a million questions, but maybe 2 million.
Yeah.
But what would you like to ask? About the Irish. We see you out on the street in very civilian clothes, and you come in here, and yet from what you've said here, with somebody who knows the kind of people you were sitting around that negotiation, you're an important guy here in this peace process, very important. And I'm embarrassed to say I didn't know about you till today. And from what I saw on the street, we would expect somebody of your status here to come in with a 3-piece business suit and somebody carrying your attaché for no. So.
Yeah, that's those perception things again, isn't it? We all have
exactly
preconceived ideas of what someone should look like based on or experience of a different situation with similarities, of course. But yeah, I suppose, I mean, peace came about in Northern Ireland from the ground up, not from the top down. And that's not always understood. And I think America has got one side of a very complex story and narrative, and hasn't necessarily understood either the loyalist side or the unionist side anywhere near the way in which they understand the Irish dimension to the Northern Ireland peace process. And that's partly our fault as British, as Unionists, as Protestants, because that story hasn't been told anywhere near in the same way in which Sinn Féin have told their story. And there's many, many reasons for that. But yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. We are very misunderstood. We are overlooked. And yet we've played and continue to play such a pivotal role in creating the space for politics to take root, to bed down in Northern Ireland.
The loyalist viewpoint seems to get lost. The public relations on the loyalist side has suffered badly over the years. Whether they like them or not, Americans know about the IRA. Every one of these kids walked into my class the first day. They weren't surprised to hear, of course, about the troubles in Northern Ireland, what the IRA is, but would have known none of the organizations on the other side of the political coin. But you're doing better. Public relations wise. Yeah.
What's your role today, Winston? Like, you began by talking about Beyond the Ireland.
Judge-led inquiries to investigate whether or not the deal that was done was lawful and constitutionally sound. And so there'll probably be a lot of court battles fought out to determine whether this was legal and lawful. People will argue that it was politically right, but constitutionally it seems to be quite, it's causing quite a stir for many folk. I think for me, I mean, I work alongside former IRA personnel every day of the week. There is still quite a lot of conflict on the streets of Northern Ireland, but not anywhere near what we would have had prior to 1998 or 1994 when the ceasefires was called. But when you take, for instance, that there's something like 7% of the whole of the population in terms of young people are schooled together. The rest are segregated. So Protestant and Catholics still in 2014 are educated in separate schools from kindergarten right through till high school.
Are integrated schools the answer? That would be like what we tried to do in the United States, geographically with busing, force black kids into white schools and vice versa.
Well, the percentage that I give is the percentage of integrated education. So there's 7% of children, young people, in integrated education. The rest are segregated. I think it has its place. I think integrated education has its place in terms of the overall structure of schooling and education, where people want to make that choice to create a situation where they are deliberately asking their children or instructing their children to go to a school that has Protestant Catholic. I think that's the right of the parent and also the right of the child. And so I think it has a massive role to play in our education system. From our own party's point of view, we would be very strong supporters of integrated education, actually.
How about the DUP or?
Less so.
Yeah.
In fact, they would be absolutely against integrated education. And funnily enough, Sinn Féin also.
Right. As opposed to SDLP, for example.
Yeah.
Good.
We Skyped with David Scott, and he said that he didn't think that integrated education was a good idea just because he thought that culture would be lost with the implementation of integrated education. And I'm curious to know as how you feel about integrated education on that.
Well, I feel quite strongly about the integrated education aspect. Look, you know, you go to school to learn, to be educated, to be taught subjects, and I think, you know, culturally, I think there are other means in which you can understand your own roots, your own heritage, your own culture, your own beliefs. I don't necessarily think you need school to do that. Of course, it can be a very useful way of understanding your own cultural background. But I think integrated education can do both. I think it can integrate children together to be educated and be taught alongside one another, and at the same time I think all of the identities, because we're not just talking about Protestant Catholic, you can have all sorts of, you know, integrated makeups. So I think we can find a way to allow people to express their culture and their identity, and for not to create some sort of neutral identity. You know, that's not the way life works. You know, I think we certainly are, from our own policy point of view, we would encourage that both Protestant, Catholic, Sikh, Hindu, Muslim, whatever the case may be, that they expose themselves to their own identity and to that of others, and not to be creating a situation whereby no one is allowed to express their identity or their culture, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
What happens to this city when that peace wall comes down?
Well, here's an interesting fun fact. There's been more peace walls created and built since 1998 than there has been taken down. So we went from, if my figures is correct, we went from 44 peace walls in Belfast, and we're now up to 88. So when Joel has probably shown you around some of the peace walls. You're going to do that. Joel will show you probably one of the most famous ones. But these physical barriers, as I like to call them, because they're not always walls, they can be fences, they can be gates, they can be very thick shrubbery, and you don't even realise that that's a divider. An outsider wouldn't realise that that's a divider, but it is. So the physical barriers have doubled since 1998. So your question then becomes quite an interesting one, because instead of taking them down, we're building more of them, and that's, I mean, there are reasons for it. It's about safety, it's about security for people, and it's about trying to manage unresolved conflict, because we still live in a very divided and polarised society. I explained to you about the education system. The housing situation is even worse. We live 95% in segregated communities or neighbourhoods or districts. And so when you are educated separately and you live separately and you socialise by and large separately within your own social group, and then we shouldn't really surprised that we have sectarianism and racism and inter-community conflict, as I would call it. So there are many outstanding issues that we need to resolve, and the political climate can shape and influence what happens at a local level. So at the moment, you just came away from an area that had a fairly serious attack last night. Republicans and loyalists clashed with one another in the early hours of this morning, just at the top of the Woodville Road where you came from. So there's another interesting fact.
They're really just gonna create tension?
I think they do both. They continue to act as a physical barrier for people to move about and be able to live without a physical wall in their lives. But we always talk about this. I mean, we need to share space, and we can only share space when we take away the obstacles and the barriers. And that's in a geographical context. There's also, we need to share the space in the psychological space. In other words, we have physical barriers, and you'll go and see one now, it's a large concrete structure. There are also psychological barriers in people's minds. There's a fear, there's a mistrust, there's a suspicion of one another because of the conflict. Like I said, we have had 3,600 killings, people lost their lives, so families still live with that trauma. I mean, we live what I would call cheek by jowl beside one another. We live on a very small island, as you know, and people who were literally murdering one another are now trying, when they live literally meters away from one another as well. So it's not just simply a case of taking down a wall. I think there's a lot of work that we need to do to prepare people for when the walls come down, and there has to be. We have to aspire to take those walls down. We just can't accept that they're part of the street furniture, if you like. They have to come down, but we have to do the work at the grassroots within communities and address that fear, address that mistrust and that suspicion. And only when we do that do I think it will be safe to bring the walls down, because when people fear one another and they're strangers to one another, and we have different cultural identities, we have different cultural practices, and we haven't found a way to mutually respect those differences. Those differences are fought out still. I mean, you will have heard about parades and protests. They are one of the most visible manifestations of conflict, and that's because we haven't dealt with a lot of stuff that's going on within people's minds. So my critique, if you like, of the peace process and of the political process has been we have concentrated on getting agreements with politicians and with political parties and putting political institutions in place, but we really haven't done any real reconciliation work at a social level, at a local level, and that's at the end of the day about people. And that's my critique of our process. And one of those learning points that I would share and ask people to take away with when they are understanding this conflict.
How well house you have to have like an education like through high school and a 4-year college, if not more. And here, like Martin McGinnis, a high school dropout, is a part of a government house. How do you feel about education and how necessary or unnecessary it is to be in that position?
I think it's a huge priority, especially education in this area, for instance. Education attainment in this area, there's something like 5% of young people will go on to higher education in this area. It is absolutely diabolical. It is criminal almost. And that's for a whole lot of reasons. There's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of disadvantage. Families can't afford to send their children to good schools. So there's all sorts of socio and economic factors for that. But you're right. There is a criticism there to be levelled at, and I can think of an example. I'll tell you who he is, but you'll be able to Google this anyway, I'm sure, when I tell you. But the health minister, I feel like in Northern Ireland at the minute, is a farmer without any educational attainment. So folk will say, well, you have a strong farming background, then you should be maybe the agricultural minister, but perhaps not so when it comes to health. And that's about politics, because obviously once you get your mandate, then you can then get placed into these different roles for all sorts of weird and wonderful reasons. But our current crop of politicians, many of them are very well educated, but there are also people that are in very powerful positions because of their status in the conflict.
Former education minister.
As a case in point. And so, yes, I recognise the importance of that education, so much so that I'm now about to graduate from university myself. So I went back to university when I was 35, so do the figures, I'm 38 now. So, yeah, that's a key priority for me.
How quickly did people accept the agreement made in 1998?
That's a really great question, because I've heard more and more people say that if they had to, we had what you call a referendum in 1998, so the entire country, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland had a vote, and people decided whether they would vote for the Good Friday Agreement, support it, or vote against it. And in Northern Ireland, 72% voted for it, supported the Good Friday Agreement, and an overwhelming majority of 92%, I think, in the Republic of Ireland voted for it. But I've heard quite recently many people saying that if they had to vote for it again, that they wouldn't. They would vote no against the agreement, because the on-the-runs have came out, because people feel that their government ministers aren't educated well enough to deliver public administration. People are saying that the social and economic conditions haven't improved for folk. And there are people who are disgruntled and very unhappy because Sinn Féin have become a very large political party within the institutions. So your question is absolutely on the money. There are many people who still to this day are coming very slow at supporting the peace and political process.
Couple more questions. How are we doing on time?
No, that was sort of about 5 minutes or whatever. Anybody wants to sort of
Yeah, no problem. So the people in, or an area of mixed.
Yeah.
So the people that live down there, are they less about taking a side, or do they still heavily stick to what they believe in, just they don't show it?
Again, that's a real good question. Yeah, I think if you're living in the centre of Belfast, you've probably done quite well in life. So there's an affluence there, there's a wealth attached to that residency. So people become less concerned about tribal issues, and that's I think that's just a fact. Of course, when it comes to voting patterns, we still vote along tribal lines. So most people who are Catholic and have a nationalist outlook will vote for SDLP or Sinn Féin, and most folk who consider themselves British and who are Protestant and who are Unionist and outlook will vote for the Unionist parties. But yeah, the city centre, I mean, it would be a shared space, so to speak. So you would have people from all sorts of different backgrounds living together as well. So that wouldn't be an area that would be segregated as such.
Do you think, maybe the last one, unless somebody has one, if this was a very vibrant economy here in Northern Ireland, and if poverty was gone, and everybody had a reasonable job with a reasonable income, do you think what we call the Troubles would disappear?
By and large, yes. I think it's about education, it's about employment. If you have a good job and you're well educated, you're less likely to want to spend the rest of your life either in prison or locked into a very conflictual situations. So yeah, I think a strong, vibrant economy would undoubtedly help the situation here in Northern Ireland.
Share one short story from your sordid past.
Keep it clean now, of course.
Without profanity, yeah. I mean, as a youth, you were these kids' age when ultimately you made the decision, I suspect, to go on the street.
Yeah, I mean, I would have probably been involved in physical force during the armed conflict from about 12, 13 years of age.
And so I don't have to do the math. How far back are we?
We're back to 1989.
89? All right.
And so, obviously, not to implicate myself.
This doesn't have to be shared.
What did you see?
Take us at our word. This part we would not share.
I had, my sister's husband was shot dead. And that had a profound effect on me and had influenced my decisions, my thinking, and ultimately my actions. That was quite a watershed moment for me. But even prior to that episode, I grew up. I was around 6 at the time of the hunger strikes in 1981. So that is my earliest memories of knowing that I was living in an abnormal society. And it was a traumatic time for everyone in Northern Ireland. So I knew from a very early age, because of, I live here, I've lived here all my life, and this area has seen another fact, not so funny. This area has seen a quarter of all murders that happened in Northern Ireland take place within a mile radius of where you sit. A quarter of all the murders, all the killings that happened during the conflict, all 3,600, a quarter of those happened within a mile radius of where we sit. So when you grow up in that environment, it's hard to avoid becoming involved in the conflict. Those who were lucky enough, whose parents were able to get up and move out, did so, and those who just didn't have the wherewithal had to stay. Many people, 30,000 people went to prison, and thousands of people lost their lives.
Knowing the situation you've been through and where you are now, if you had the chance to go back and leave before you got involved, would you have left or would you have stayed involved to be where you are now?
Wow.
That's an easy one.
If I had been in a position to get up and leave, it's a very subjective thing for me to say now, because I feel very strongly, because of my life experience has been shaped by all of the events and all of the things that's happened in my life. So I feel very strongly about my community, about my political beliefs, about my history and my culture and my identity. So I'm inclined to say no right off. No, I wouldn't move. But then there's a part of me that would say, well, if I didn't have all of those experiences, then I probably would have, if I'm being honest. But it's one of those questions that it's a hypothetical question, of course, but really got me thinking. And I suppose, you could, if things were to break out again and conflict was, I have a young family now myself, so if things were to get really bad again and get really nasty, I suppose the more pertinent question would be, well, what would you do now? Would you stay or would you leave? And that's an equally difficult question. I try my best to make sure we don't go back there. And it's for that, I'm so afraid and so fearful that my children would have to live the experience that I lived. And so it's almost a vocation for me that I need to stay and I need to try and continue to build on the foundations of the peace process to make sure that we don't slip back at some stage. So I would be too afraid to leave, because I know the importance of staying and making sure that we continue to find agreements and continue to build relationships and peace. I suppose I'm a homebird. So yeah, I'll probably stay.
Thank you. Do you think that the generation born after the peace process is less likely to go into a violent direction because they didn't really get to witness all of the most severe violence? Or do you think that as long as there's socioeconomic problems and as long as the schools are segregated, for example, that you'll never really get to that place where there's really no chance of serious violence happening in the future?
I suppose on one level, because people haven't had the experience, the horrors of conflict, they don't realise what they could get themselves into, and that's a very dangerous situation. And I see young people on both sides of the divide, both Protestant and Catholic, who, if we weren't on the ground, would rip each other apart if they could. And it's because they're probably getting stories handed down to them by their families and in their communities from what the other side did unto us. And like I said, both sides did awful things unto one another. So there is that real danger, because people haven't experienced the impact and the effects. But on the other level, that's a good thing, because they don't have the same baggage that I had and that I have. in my life. So it's a fine balance, and I think that's why education becomes really important then, because even if you haven't had the experience of conflict and what it can do to you, if you're still living your life with limited knowledge and an ignorance, and with a poor education, I think you're really exposed and being put at risk. So it's really important that we don't take it for granted and assume just because people don't have that conflict and that baggage in their lives that they wouldn't slip into it.
I think that's just going ahead now, yeah.
That does it?
Is it okay?